Okay.
Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn, Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Doug Rogers, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Yale University. His research and teaching interests include political and economic anthropology, natural resource extraction and energy, the anthropology of religion, and socialist societies and their post-socialist trajectories. He has done archival and ethnographic research in Russia since 1994 and is currently working on an ethnography-based project titled Oil Culture, Producing the New Russia. Today we'll talk with Professor Rogers about his groundbreaking book. Welcome, Professor Rogers.
Hi, Marilyn. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Sure. So the book is called Oil Culture, Producing the New Russia, and it's in part about Russian oil and in part about Russian culture. There's sort of two main premises to the book. The first one is that I don't think we've really understood very well the place of oil in Soviet and post-Soviet history. There's a lot of studies that deal with sort of oil at the top of the economy and Putin or Yeltsin and the oligarchs and companies and corporate histories. But how the big Russian oil boom has worked on the ground, how the Soviet oil industry worked in practice, we know a lot less about this. And so one premise of the book is simply to sort of understand what's going on, which sort of feeds into the second purpose, which is I think what's going on is a lot different than what we see in other parts of the world where oil is produced, say in Nigeria or Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or even the United States, where there's been a lot of study of this industry and the effects of an oil boom on a local community or on different kinds of social structures or cultural practices. We don't know a lot about Russia, and Russia I think is going to turn out to be quite different because of this history. And so I'm interested in sort of excavating, I suppose, this history and then putting it in some kind of dialogue with what we know about the rest of the world and exploring some of those similarities and differences.
Okay. So what led you to write the book?
Well, a lot of things in research turn out by surprise, especially in anthropology. Things sort of catch you by surprise or things are unexpected. So I've been going to Russia and doing field work in this particular region that I study, the Perm region, which is sort of near the Urals. So not Moscow, not European Russia, and not Siberia either, somewhere in the middle. I've been going there for 20 years, and I lived there in 2001 for a whole year in a village. And I was researching agriculture and religion and how things had changed since the end of the Soviet Union. I wrapped up that project. That was my first book. And I was looking for something new to write about and new to think about. And this was the early mid-2000s when oil was becoming a big thing. This is an oil-producing region. Friends I had were going to work in the oil industry. All of a sudden, people I knew were becoming fantastically rich if they lived in or had some association with an oil-producing region. So it seemed like an interesting thing to dig into.
Right, right. And there is very little for you to draw upon, right? So that was kind of, a bit of a surprise, I would imagine.
Well, that's right. I mean, there's a lot of fantastic Russian scholarship, Russian language scholarship, local history and people there writing about these things. But there really hasn't been a lot of stuff written by academics in Western Europe or the United States that takes into account these ground level things. People tend to write about the big name things that you read about in newspapers, big company deals or Putin's struggles with the oligarchs, but how oil money flows in a particular town or how the exchange of oil gets organized or what company is sponsoring what museum or these things that I'm interested in, people there were talking about, there wasn't much to go on.
I see. And why do you think that is?
Well, there's a couple things, I think. I'm from a discipline, anthropology, that's very based on field work. You go and live places and hang out and try to understand things from the inside. And it's a fairly young discipline with respect to Russia and the former Soviet Union. In the Cold War, this was not possible. You couldn't go live there. Anthropologists were elsewhere in the world. So it's only really since the 1990s that any anthropology was possible in the former Soviet Union. So there's a sort of a generation ahead of me, but I'm the second generation of people who've been able to do field work. So there hasn't been much time to do these things. So that's one thing, and anthropologists have only really recently become interested in oil and energy at all. So that is not.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, anthropologists, there's been some studies, but this has not been a major focus of attention, at least in recent years. Some in the 70s, oil crisis, and then in the World War II era, there were sort of little boomlets of anthropologists interested in energy. But it's, in a big way, has happened in the past few years. So I think the combination of those two things.
Now, I am curious, why did you pick that particular area of Russia out of every other place in the world you could have studied?
Well, that is also a tale of coincidence.
Okay.
That begins really when I was an undergraduate at Middlebury College, and I was spending my junior year abroad and wanting to learn about religion and things like this. And I met some people in Moscow who said, well, we study religion. Why don't you come with us? This summer, we're going out to the Perm region to study, religious communities there. I said, all right, why not? I was a junior in college. I had the summer free. So I spent the summer out in the rural areas of the Perm region with this crowd. And that was 1994. And I have not stopped going back since then. So it's coincidence followed by inertia, I think is the...
So how did you do the research for the book? Tell us about the methodology.
Sure. So anthropology is a largely, not entirely, but largely a fieldwork-based discipline. You go and you talk to people. So it's very much based on interviews, some of them very formal, where I have sort of a set of questions that I definitely want to ask somebody. But I also pay a lot of attention to informal conversations or chats that I have with people who I meet who are either in the oil industry or in government, or given my interest in Russian culture, in cultural fields, in, say, they work in museums. And so it's very much based on interviews. There's also a lot of sort of newspaper and media research. For the older part, the Soviet part, there's some archival research. But it's assembled from these different pieces of sort of empirical on the ground, some of which are structured, but a lot of which are just fortuitous, that they just happen.
Right.
And that has allowed me to build up these larger.
Right. So let's talk about some of your findings. And actually, in doing the research, did anything you come across say, wow, I wasn't anticipating that, or, very surprising kind of thing?
Oh, all the time.
Really?
I guess I've sort of gotten used to it because, the unexpected things are fairly common in fieldwork and ethnographic research, because life is a fairly unexpected thing. And what you want to do is capture that and not edit it out as you're, compiling your data or something. But I was very surprised by and interested in the way in which the identity of the Perm region has become wrapped up in the oil industry, and how the oil industry has become a big sponsor of local cultural festivals and museums. And in part, this is sort of an effort to blunt critiques and respond to people's critiques of their new wealth and things like this. But it's very deeply implicated in very local cultural understandings. There's a lot of research about Russian nationalism being based on oil wealth and at the very high sort of federal, statewide, countrywide Russian things. But what I was finding was that most people's entry levels to identity were not national. They were in large part very local, connected to the region or the district or very, very particular cultural traditions. So that was an interesting and somewhat surprising finding.
And so what about some of your other findings?
Sure. Well, going back to one of the original premises of the book, I said was to put Russia in comparison with other places.
Right. So tell us how it's different.
Here's just one example of a few that I deal with. The post-Soviet oil industry in the Perm region in the 1990s was built largely on barter, non-monetized exchange. And there's nothing in the West and in many of the Western or post-colonial oil-producing countries, it's all about oil money. I mean, there's no commodity that is more closely associated with money. We see it at every gas station, the price in money of oil. Russia in the 1990s, because of state crises and economic catastrophe, basically, people are trading oil without money and many other things without money. So this new oil elite and this new industry and the place of oil in that regional state apparatus was very much built without money. And that, even though money is now quite a hugely important thing in the 2000s, that history is still important for the structure of things and people's instincts and expectations.
So are they still bartering today as well as?
Somewhat. I mean, not nearly to the extent of the 1990s, but somewhat. I mean, if you look at many of the international deals that Russia does in oil and gas, particularly with former Soviet countries, from Moldova through Ukraine into Central Asia. Many of these are in fact barter or part barter deals. And to get back to the global scene, if you look harder, and people haven't because they expect oil and money to be so closely related, there's actually a lot of global oil trade that is barter. And I think that changes the way we should look at the oil industry on a global scale. And it's the kind of thing we see particularly well if we look at 1990s Russia, which was such a clear example of this. But then once you start looking, you find China in Africa these days. Many of these deals for oil in Africa made by Chinese companies are barter-based. You give us the oil, we build a dam. There's not a monetary transaction in there. So thinking through those kinds of things enables us to see, from the perspective of Russia, something new about the whole picture.
So in the area that you look at in Russia, tell me about the population. Would it be mostly middle class, upper middle class? I mean, or is there more of a hierarchy, low, middle,
Right,
kind of
absolutely, an excellent question. And one of the clear things that the oil industry has been involved in changing. So the Perm region is about 2 million people, about 1 million in the main city of Perm. The rest spread out through the region. In what used to be Soviet agricultural towns and a lot of heavy industry, defense industry, things like this in the Soviet period. The coming of the oil industry in the post-Soviet period has dramatically increased inequality, as a lot of wealth has been concentrated in those districts that are associated with the oil industry and the people who work for the oil companies. So you find enormous levels of inequality that you certainly didn't have in the Soviet period. In this region that are really traceable to the coming of a particularly kind of capitalist oil industry.
So there's inequality in the area you study?
Absolutely.
Okay. So some people just miss the boat in terms of getting involved with, oil companies or?
Well, that's part of it. Part of it is just fortuitous if there's oil under you or not.
Yeah.
This is an old American story as well, right? Where is the oil and who gets it? And so that's some of it is just sort of accident of geography. Some of it is the fact that the oil industry is particular in that it's a fairly low labor industry. You need a lot of money and a lot of high technology to extract oil, but once you've dug the well, you only need a few people there laboring to, so the population involved in the oil industry is very small.
I see.
It's not like a mine where you'd have like whole segments of the population involved in mining.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that. So then, are the oil companies then, you had mentioned them sponsoring a lot of different kinds of events. Are they putting money back into the culture in terms of education, that kind of thing, healthcare?
They certainly are, and in all of these domains, healthcare, education, culture, whether it's enough or whether it's a public relations campaign or whether it's really only papering over inequality and ecological damage is one of the items of debate in the Perm region as elsewhere in the oil-producing world, in the U.S., upstate New York or Nigeria or elsewhere. But certainly that's there. And one of the particularities with the way this has happened in the post-Soviet period is that that practice of corporate sponsorship grew up right alongside the reemergence of the state. And they're very closely tied together. This is the part of the argument of the book, is that the oil company in the healthcare industry is very closely allied with the state government in the healthcare industry. Same for culture, same for education. So these things are very closely entwined, not just at the level of, say, the federal budget in Moscow, but at the level of practice in the particular regions and cities where the oil industry operates.
Do you foresee any change in the future?
It's very hard to predict, and I have spent much of the semester embarrassing myself in front of my students with predictions about Ukraine and Crimea, in which I'm constantly proven wrong on a daily basis. So I think I will abstain from the prediction industry for now.
Okay. And then, in terms of what do you conclude in the book ultimately?
Well, I think one of the main conclusions of the book, there's all these little conclusions about how it's working and what the comparisons are, but one of the main conclusions and one of the main takeaway points is that we really haven't understood Russia as an oil-producing country as well as we should have. We need to understand not just things about the federal budget or tax policy or what the size of the oil company's reserves is, but really how oil and culture and society have become twined together in contemporary Russia. And I think a better understanding of that is fairly crucial for our understandings of Russia in the post-Soviet period.
Right, right. Very good. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
For more information about Professor Rogers and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.